In Shanghai, we were presenting Latin Americans from Brazil to Ecuador and the opportunities they offer to Chinese investors. And most people continue to think that sometime around mid-century, the Chinese will inherit the earth and the mighty redback, currently getting rather ignored after an exciting debut, one must admit that the mighty redback will knock the greenback off its perch. As it happens, I don't believe that myself, but then I've been wrong before, notwithstanding which, do consider that in that land of plenty, 1 billion live at subsistence levels, credit is state allocated, price is state manipulated, and if you assume we're being allowed to see only the tip of the political iceberg, and that tip looks pretty peculiar just at the moment, imagine the true struggle for power that's really going on between the old guard and the young princes. And while Chinese macro data all trend down, an anxious world analyses the conflicting signals over will they, won't they, go for another massive fiscal stimulus a la 2008, 2009, and the anxious world holds its breath, knowing in its heart that from the Australian dollar to the soya plains of Brazil, from the mines of Zambia to the watch manufacturers of Geneva, there's a giant unhedged one-way bet on a prosperous China. Fiscal stimulus, or the firing of a funny money missile. That was also on the minds of the 1,000 or so bankers and investors who gathered with us in Munich later in the week to talk about bonds. More specifically, Mario Draghi's promise that the European Central Bank, hear what comfortable words St. Mario saith, that the ECB would engage in unlimited buying of the sovereign bonds of peripheral Eurozone members. The relief rally was palpable, and our bond bankers celebrated in style. Munich's a good place to do that. Of course, Super Mario can let go with his big bazooka only when the Kingdom of Spain formally requests a bailout, which they have staunchly insisted they will not do. And one can see why. With 50% unemployment among young people, social unrest not far from the surface, and no appetite for the Greek-style austerity and sovereignty loss that a bailout would bring. So where does that leave us? With brinkmanship and lots more last chances to go is where. And where will Euromoney conferences be next week? All over. But I hone in on one event in New York, our annual US Inflation-Linked Bonds Conference. To put it in a nutshell, the so-called QE3, launched on Thursday by the Bank of Bernanke, has brought, or will bring, into existence 1,500 billion US dollars that weren't there before, while at the same time saying the Fed's formal orientation now is one of targeting employment, and so not targeting inflation, and so perhaps why the New York Inflation Conference is sold out. I guess every cloud has a silver lining. And so, welcome to the Nigeria Banking and Capital Markets Conference. Nigeria, despite its successful forays into global bond markets, matched of course by similar issues from some of its banks, of which no doubt more later, Nigeria is a low-debt nation. In fact, and this is a good place to start, this country has a negative net external debt, also known as a credit. And of the debt outstanding, the vast majority is in local currency. So there's another emerging market original sin out of the way. Our idea for this conference grew out of the notion that the banking sector reforms, beginning 3 years ago, more or less exactly, and when we were last here, when Governor Sanusi took out his big hammer and delivered a wake-up blow to the banks, that those reforms, along with the more recent reforms in capital markets, plus the successful running of the AMCON, together amount to a rebirth in the Nigerian financial services industry. And as a result of that rebirth, and the capital formation and capital intermediation it ought to mean, the finance industry in Nigeria could, would, or should start to play its proper role in developing the real economy, diversifying away from oil and creating jobs and sustainable jobs in agriculture, manufacturing, services. Banks the world over are squeezed by regulation and by capital constraint, and here it seems most especially by the temptation to act as warehouses for government bonds. So we may ask some of them a bit later about that. But what that banking squeeze means everywhere, Nigeria must be no exception, is that capital markets must stand ready to provide capital for entrepreneurs and for infrastructure and for growth. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the degree of that readiness and the necessary conditions for Nigeria's banks and markets to play their part that we are here today to discuss. And we discuss it, as I hope my little tour d'horizon showed, against a pretty febrile backdrop outside Nigeria. We've got a panel of, well, 4, but 5 potentially, eminent people here to do just that, and there being no keynote speaker to introduce, I shall go and join. Kayode Akinkugbe is, what is your title? CEO of First Bank Capital? First BM Capital. He'll give me a card in a minute and then we'll know all about it. Formerly you were at Deutsche Bank when we first met, I think, weren't you? Yeah, so you've come to a much better institution.
Absolutely.
Deutsche Bank firing. Good times. Okay, Kayode mentioned earlier on Deutsche Bank, obviously a preeminent Eurozone financial institution. I know you don't represent them, I'm not trying to trick you into saying that you do or anything like that, but you have a view from here on the Eurozone crisis. I'd just like to tell you what you think of Conrad's analysis, and if you see any chance at all that the Germans will permit essentially the Eurobonds. They're talked about the underwriting of the collective debt, which seems to be one of the very few things which might solve the crisis. Do you see any possibility of that happening? And then I'm going to come on and ask you a subsidiary question about China. So you get Europe and China for being late.
Thank you very much.
Don't mention it.
To be fair, if I may say, in the last year, I focused most of my attention on the local economy. And I think, fortunately, I can certainly say, as Conrad has said, I'm extremely happy to be home. Because quite frankly, when you look offshore and you see what's going on, it's a very, very unpleasant picture. Sort of stepping out and if I may say, putting on a European hat, perhaps. When you are an economy like Germany that has already gone through a period where it had to sort of bail out another economy, which was East Germany at the time, I can really understand the reservation and the reluctance, quite frankly, from the German authorities towards putting in place some kind of debt capital market instrument that effectively enables others who, quite frankly, have, perhaps irresponsible is too strong a word, but quite frankly, other economies that have not really kept to the path as they should have, and Greece is clearly the most sort of prominent example of that. But I'm not one that, quite frankly, is in favor of that sort of approach where there's in effect some sort of indirect subsidization.
So if you were a German taxpayer or indeed a German voter, you would be against mutualization of the debt?
Yes, I would.
So do you see any other outcome in the short or medium term which could take this crisis out of the headlines?
My sense is that where there's there has to be some consequence for actions, and to the extent that certain economies have not managed their affairs as efficiently as they perhaps should have, there needs to be consequences. I won't say too much more, but I think
that's fine. I think we get where you're coming from.
Exactly.
I made a remark in my opening remarks when I just did a little sort of tour around the world. China, I described the Chinese economy as a giant unhedged bet. on behalf of people as diverse as Australian commodity producers and Swiss watchmakers, or you might say, the manufacturers of luxury goods all over Europe, and indeed South American oil producers, for example. Is that a worry for you? I mean, clearly China has an enormous role to play in terms of buying everything that everybody's got, has had recently. You follow, I'm sure, the Chinese kind of macro landscape. Is China's cooling off and the apparent, so far at least, lack of commitment to a stimulus which might warm it up again? Is that something that worries you when you look at the sort of the world economic picture?
I think to an extent, China has certainly replaced the US in terms of being the sort of growth engine for the world economy. But I think there are, it would seem, the sort of nearish to medium term, some positive signs perhaps emerging in the US. So whilst things may potentially slow down with China, hopefully the US may be able to come back, to take up some of the slack.
So China doesn't worry you to the extent that you think that the US
potentially the US may be able to.
Okay.
But looking sort of more directly at Nigeria and China, certainly any sort of cooling is a worry, because I think we're certainly trying to strengthen our relationship, and we're certainly looking for a lot more inbound capital from China, and so if there is a risk to that going somewhere else, I think that's certainly a worry for Nigeria.
Well, going somewhere else.